All right, now I'm winding the story on 30 years from the collapse of Chartism, and I want you to picture a scene that took place down there on the platform of Waverley Station here in Edinburgh. I want you to picture a steam train and a crowd of people, and leaning out of the train window, making a speech, whipping up the crowd, hoping for their votes, a grand old statesman, the Liberal politician William Gladstone. He was up here fighting what's become known as the Midlothian campaign of 1880, and it's famous as Britain's first recognisably modern election campaign. What made the Midlothian campaign so modern wasn't just Gladstone's tireless energy, the way he beetled around addressing tens of thousands of electors in church halls, in market squares. What made this campaign so new and exciting were the people that came to hear him speak, not the comfortable minority who'd held the reins of power for so long, but ordinary people. Because, you see, in the 30 years that followed the collapse of the Chartist movement, the dreams of the Chartists, amazingly, began to come true. The franchise, the number of electors in this country, opened up. Working class men got the vote for the very first time. Not all of them, but some. And here, in Edinburgh, in 1880, we had our very first limited glimpse of democracy in action. Why, though, this transformation? How was it finally that the vote moved into the hands of the working class? Well, to understand that, we've got to understand how things had changed generally in the course of the 19th century. And to do that, I'm going on a journey into the very bowels of Edinburgh's Old Town. Nowadays, Edinburgh is such a refined, genteel city. It's hard to imagine this place as it once was. But back in the 1840s, the Old Town here was notorious. A grim, polluted, overcrowded slum. It smelt so bad, Edinburgh's nickname was Old Reekie. I'm in a section of the old Edinburgh slums that, rather than being pulled down, were actually built over. So I'm under the streets now of present-day Edinburgh. And what we've got down here is a historical time capsule, a glimpse of life as it was lived by the poorest of Edinburgh's poor. And it's a chilling, quite distressing place. I've read accounts of cellars like these, crammed full of more people than you'd find in the cells of the local prisons. Disease, destitution, prostitution, crime, this kind of squalor dragged people down. Now, to rewind, what was Chartism about? Chartism was about winning the vote so that ordinary people would have the power to improve these miserable conditions. But Chartism had failed. Parliament had slammed the door. And the question now for the working class was, what next? And I think at this point, most people simply turned their backs on Parliament. The campaign for the vote fizzled out. People realized Parliament wasn't going to help them. If they wanted to do something about their lives, they'd have to help themselves. Self-help. That was the title of a book published in 1859 by a Midlothian man with the curious name of Samuel Smiles. He'd studied in Edinburgh. He'd joined the Chartists. But in the 1850s, he'd lost his faith in parliamentary reform. And he'd written the book that would become, after the Bible, the #1 bestseller in Victorian Britain. It preached the virtues of thrift, industry, progress. It called on ordinary people to rise out of hardship, to better themselves, to become respectable. It was the textbook of the Victorian age. All right, by way of contrast with that glimpse of the grim old town, I wanted to show you this housing estate, the Stockbridge estate, which for me sums up this idea of self-help. The Stockbridge estate was built by the Edinburgh Cooperative Building Company, basically a bunch of builders who joined together to help themselves. They were each working as labourers, earning a daily wage, struggling to make ends meet. But they'd fallen out with their employers. They'd asked for more money. They'd been barred from building sites across the city. And so they'd joined together. They'd formed a cooperative. They'd approached other sympathetic tradesmen, plumbers, plasterers, joiners. They'd all invested in stocks and shares in this new company, a pound here, a few shillings there. And from 1861, within about 10 years, they'd built 1,000 decent, quality, solid houses like these, not just providing themselves with employment, but giving the poor families of Edinburgh the means to escape the squalor of the slums. You look at the map of Edinburgh today, you can still see the dozen or so colonies, little pockets of housing, row upon row of well-constructed, affordable terraces, all built by the Edinburgh CoOp. They're still called the colonies. Why? Because their symbol was the beehive, a metaphor for hard work and industry. And in that one image, you can see the transformation that's come upon the Victorian working class. All that anger in the Chartist years, translated now into a buzzing, purposeful energy. It was this transformation in working culture in Britain that actually changed the whole equation in the story I'm telling, the balance of power between ordinary people and the ruling elite. Why? Because the ruling elite looked at the working classes now and they didn't see a threatening mob anymore. They didn't see a swinish multitude. They saw a class of solid, industrious artisans, and they learnt to respect them. They came to think of them as the backbone of England. And once the fear was gone, the reform movement could crank back into gear, led now by the very elite that had barred reform for so long. In 1867, the Tory party passed a truly great Reform Act, hailed at the time as the leap in the dark. The franchise was doubled to include now skilled working men in the towns and the cities. You know, what I think the ruling elite had finally come to understand was that democracy doesn't weaken a nation, it makes a nation strong. It's when people aren't represented that they stand outside the fold, angry, resentful. Invite people into the fold of government, it becomes our government. You fight for it, not against it. And that, of course, is exactly what happened. Skilled workers, armed with the vote, didn't rise up and overthrow the established order. And our democracy has stayed strong to this day. And so the story returns to 1880, to the so-called Midlothian campaign, when William Gladstone came here to ask the working people of Edinburgh for their permission to represent them in Parliament. It's said that Queen Victoria, a crushing old snob, was appalled at what she saw as this undignified spectacle. A grand old man like Gladstone on bended knee to the crowd. The fact is, this was a cause for celebration. No, this wasn't universal suffrage. Only half of men, and as yet no women at all, had got the vote. But out of a newfound confidence, our journey to democracy had finally begun.